How much do you really know about surviving in the tough world of the medieval ages? Around the years 1000 to 1400, do you think you could feed yourself, clothe yourself, or even fix your own crumbling house with nothing but your hands and some basic tools? What if your very life depended on knowing how to read the land, heal a sickness without a doctor, or turn raw wool into a warm cloak? Forget formal schools and fancy degrees. For the vast majority of people, everyday existence demanded a completely different kind of education. Number 7. Plowing the land and sowing the seeds. The most fundamental skill, the absolute bedrock of medieval peasant life, was the mastery of farming. This was not a hobby. It was a grueling year-round commitment that dictated every aspect of their existence. A silent curriculum passed from one generation to the next. Learning to work the land was a lifelong apprenticeship. Beginning in childhood as small hands helped with simple tasks and progressing to the back-breaking labor of adulthood. The very first step each year, after the long winter slumber, was preparing the soil. This meant plowing. For many peasants, especially in the earlier medieval period, the tools were deceptively simple, yet their use required immense strength and skill. The ard, sometimes called a scratch plow, was a basic wooden implement, often tipped with iron. It did not turn the soil over but merely scratched a furrow, creating a shallow channel for seeds. Later, the heavier moldboard plow, a more advanced invention, truly turned the soil, aerating it and burying weeds. But it demanded more power, usually requiring a team of sturdy oxen, sometimes as many as 8. Imagine guiding those powerful beasts, holding the heavy plow handles as the iron share bit into the earth, the smell of freshly turned soil rising with each slow, deliberate pass. The ground was often uneven, rocky, and stubborn, making the process a constant battle of brute force and newest control. An inexperienced hand would quickly find the plow, veering off course, snagging on roots, or simply refusing to bite. The furrows needed to be straight and consistent, a testament to the plower's mastery. After the initial plowing, the clods of earth needed to be broken down. This was often done with a harrow, a wooden frame with spikes or teeth, pulled by an animal or dragged by hand. It leveled the field and prepared a fine seedbed. The timing of these tasks was everything. Plowing too early meant the soil would be too wet and heavy, clumping rather than crumbling. Plowing too late risked missing the optimal planting window. Peasants learned to read the subtle signs of the earth, the way the frost left the ground, the texture of the soil, the changing patterns of rainfall. Their very lives depended on this intimate knowledge. Next came the critical moment of sowing the seeds. This was not done with modern drills and ironry. Instead, it was a dance of hand and eye. Peasant would walk across the prepared field rhythmically, scattering handfuls of precious grain, wheat, barley, rye, or oats, in an arc before them. This technique, called broadcasting, required incredible precision. Too many seeds in one spot meant overcrowding and stunted growth. Too few meant wasted land and a sparse harvest. The sower had to account for wind, for the natural variations in the soil, and for the way the seeds would fall. It was a skill honed over decades, passed down by observing the seasoned elders, whose hands seemed to know exactly how much grain to release, and with what swing of the arm. The specific crops planted varied by region and season, but the general principle of the three-field system became common. One field for a winter crop, like wheat or rye, one for a spring crop, barley or oats, and one left fallow to rest and regain fertility. This system, while an improvement over two-field rotation, still meant a third of the land lay unproductive each year, a constant reminder of the fragility of their food supply through the growing season. The work continued. Weeding was a constant, back-breaking chore, performed by hand-pulling competing plants from among the precious crops. Vigilance against pests from hungry birds to destructive rodents was also part of the daily routine, often involving scarecrows or simple traps. There was no chemical pest control, no large-scale irrigation, only human labor and reliance on nature's whims. Finally, the harvest arrived, the most intense and critical period of the year. The grain, ripe and heavy, needed to be cut before it could shed its seeds or be damaged by rain. This was a race against time, requiring every able-bodied person. Peasants wielded sickles, small curved blades for cutting stalks close to the ground, or later, the larger scythe, a long handle with a curved blade, which allowed for a wider swing but demanded immense strength and coordination. Hour after hour, under the blazing summer sun, they would bend and cut, gathering the stalks into bundles called sheaves. The fields would be cleared row by row, the sheaves piled into stooks or shocks to dry in the sun before being carted back to the village. The physical toll was immense. Backs ached, hands blistered, and muscles screamed. Yet, the work could not stop. Once the grain was brought in, it was not yet ready. The next crucial step was threshing, separating the edible grain kernels from the inedible stalks and husks. This was often done on a threshing floor, a hard, flat surface. The sheaves were spread out and peasants would beat them with flails, long poles with a shorter hinged section that swung down to strike the grain. It was rhythmic, dusty work, often done communally, the sound of flails echoing across the village. The goal was to dislodge every precious kernel. After threshing came winnowing, the final separation. The mixture of grain and chaff, the lighter husks, was tossed into the air, often with a large flat basket or shovel. The wind would carry away the lighter chaff, leaving the heavier grain to fall back down. This required a keen sense of the wind's direction and strength, a practiced flick of the wrist. It was a skill that literally put food on the table. Finally, the seeds for the next year's planting had to be carefully selected and stored. The best, most robust kernels were set aside, representing the hope for the following season. This was a conscious act of agricultural management, ensuring the continuation of their livelihood. Every step from breaking ground to saving seed was a direct education in the cycles of nature, the demands of survival, and the unwavering discipline required to keep starvation at bay. The land was their classroom, and the harvest was their brutal, beautiful examination. Number 6. Caring for livestock and their products. Beyond the fields, the medieval peasant's life was deeply intertwined with animals. Livestock were not just sources of food, they were partners in labor, providers of raw materials, and living investments. The ability to care for these creatures from birth to the end of their lives was an indispensable skill learned through observation, trial, and the hard lessons of experience. Pigs were common, often allowed to roam freely in the village or forest, foraging for acorns and roots, though they would be penned for fattening closer to slaughter time. Peasants learned to recognize the signs of a healthy pig versus one that was ailing, understanding its diet and habits. Sows were crucial for producing piglets, ensuring a continuous supply of meat and lard, which was vital for cooking and preservation. The timing of breeding, the care of the pregnant sow, and the protection of the vulnerable young piglets were all knowledge passed through generations. Cattle, especially oxen, were the powerhouses of the medieval farm. These strong, patient animals were essential for plowing the heavy earth, pulling carts laden with harvests, and performing other demanding tasks. Training an ox team was a lengthy process, starting when the animals were young. Peasants learned to yoke the oxen together, to guide them with verbal commands and subtle prods, making them work in unison. This required immense patience and a deep understanding of animal behavior. A poorly trained ox team could ruin a day's plowing or even injure their handler. For families fortunate enough to have a cow, milk was a precious resource. Milking a cow by hand required a specific technique, a gentle but firm touch to encourage the flow and an understanding of the cow's temperament. The milk was often consumed fresh, but it was also transformed into butter and cheese, essential for adding variety and vital fats to a limited diet. Process of churning butter, waiting for the cream to separate, or pressing cheese, understanding curd formation, were home-based skills learned from mothers and grandmothers. Sheep were incredibly versatile animals, providing wool for clothing, meat, and sometimes even milk. Managing a flock, even a small one, involved a complex set of skills. Shearing the sheep, typically done once a year in late spring or early summer, was a delicate operation. Peasants used hand shears, sharp metal tools that required careful manipulation to remove the fleece in one piece without cutting the animal. This was a communal event, often involving neighbors helping neighbors, sharing the heavy work. After shearing, the sheep still needed care. Their hooves had to be trimmed to prevent lameness, and they were vulnerable to diseases and parasites. Peasant knew the signs of a sick sheep: lethargy, unusual discharges, changes in appetite. They would use traditional remedies, often derived from local herbs, to treat ailments, attempting to save their valuable animals. Lambing season was a time of intense vigilance, with shepherds staying up through the night to assist ewes with difficult births, protecting the vulnerable lambs from predators and the cold. Chickens were ubiquitous, providing eggs and occasional meat. They were relatively easy to care for, often left to scratch for food around the homestead. However, peasants still needed to understand their habits, where they laid eggs, how to protect them from foxes and stoats, and when a hen was broody, ready to hatch a new clutch of chicks. Ducks and geese might also be kept, providing eggs, meat, and even feathers for bedding. Beyond daily care, peasants learned basic animal husbandry practices that bordered on veterinary science. They understood rudimentary breeding principles, recognizing desirable traits in their animals, and choosing which ones to breed to improve their stock over time. They understood when animals were in heat, when to separate males from females, and how long gestation periods lasted. They learned about animal anatomy, especially during the grim but necessary process of slaughtering an animal for meat. This was not a task for the squeamish. It required precision, efficiency, and respect for the animal that was providing sustenance. Every part of the animal was utilized: meat, fat, blood for puddings, bones for tools or broth, hides for leather, and wool for textiles. The health of their animals was paramount, as a sick animal meant a direct threat to the family's survival. Peasants observed changes in an animal's behavior, respiration, or excretions. They knew which herbs could be given to ease digestive issues, which poultices could help with wounds, and how to set a basic splint for a broken leg. They understood that overcrowding or poor sanitation could lead to disease, and they practiced simple methods of hygiene, like regularly cleaning out animal pens, to mitigate these risks. The relationship between peasants and their livestock was a partnership, a daily give and take that was absolutely essential for survival. The animals provided the power for the fields, the raw materials for clothing, and the food for the table. In return, the peasants provided shelter, sustenance, and vigilant care, a reciprocal arrangement that underscored the pragmatic genius of their traditional skills. Number 5. Turning harvest into sustenance. Having grown the crops and raised the animals, the next monumental task for medieval peasants was transforming these raw materials into edible, storable food that would last through the lean months. This was a complex, multi-stage process, demanding a wealth of practical knowledge and a deep understanding of preservation techniques. Without refrigeration or modern processing, their ingenuity was a matter of life or death. Grain, the staple of their diet, needed considerable processing. After threshing and winnowing, the kernels still contained their tough outer husks and were not readily digestible. They needed to be ground into flour. While some villages might have had a communal watermill or windmill, many peasants relied on quern stones, two large flat stones used by hand. The upper stone, often with a wooden handle, was rotated against the lower one, slowly grinding the grain trapped between them. This was an arduous, repetitive task, often performed daily, with the rhythmic scrape and crunch of stone against grain filling the humble homes. The resulting flour was often coarse, containing some bran, but it was the basis of their bread, porridge, and pottage. Baking bread was a core household skill, almost a daily ritual. After the flour was mixed with water, a starter, sourdough from a previous batch, or a simple yeast culture, and often a pinch of salt, it would be kneaded vigorously. The dough was then left to rise in a warm spot. Many villages had communal ovens, large, domed structures heated by wood fires. Peasants would bring their prepared loaves to the oven, paying a small fee or a portion of the bread for its use. The baker, or a designated villager, would manage the fire and the baking process, ensuring each loaf was cooked through. The smell of baking bread was a rare luxury, signaling sustenance and security. Without access to a communal oven, some peasants might bake their bread on a griddle over an open fire, producing flatbreads or less consistent loaves. Meat preservation was another critical skill, especially after the annual autumn slaughter of pigs or other animals too expensive to feed through winter. Salting was the most common method. The meat would be rubbed vigorously with coarse salt, often mixed with herbs, and then packed tightly into wooden barrels or earthenware pots. The salt drew out moisture, inhibiting bacterial growth. This process created salted pork or beef, which could last for months, though it was incredibly salty and often needed to be soaked in water before cooking. Smoking was another popular method, particularly for hams and bacon. Meat would be hung in a smokehouse or near the chimney, allowing the smoke from a slow-burning fire to cure and flavor it. This also helped repel insects and bacteria. These preserved meats formed a vital protein reserve during winter. Fish, especially for communities near rivers or the coast, was also preserved. Drying fish, especially cod or herring, was a simple but effective method. Fish would be cleaned, gutted, and then hung outdoors in the sun and wind to dry. The lean, hard fish could then be stored for extended periods. Salting was also used for fish. Beyond meat and fish, peasants also preserved fruits and vegetables. Drying was the most straightforward method. Apples, berries, and certain herbs were spread out in the sun or near the fire to dehydrate. Dry product could then be stored in cloth, bags, or baskets. Root vegetables like carrots, parsnips, and turnips, along with cabbages, were stored in cool, dark root cellars or clamps, pits dug in the ground and covered with straw and earth, which kept them protected from frost and spoilage. Pickling, while less common than salting or drying, was also known, using vinegar or fermented brines for vegetables like cabbage, leading to early forms of sauerkraut. Brewing was a skill possessed by almost every household, particularly the women. Ale made from barley was a fundamental part of the peasant diet, often safer to drink than water, which could be contaminated. The process involved malting the barley, allowing it to sprout slightly to convert starches to sugars, crushing it, mashing it with hot water, fermenting the resulting liquid with wild yeasts, and sometimes flavoring it with hops or other herbs. The daily consumption of weak ale provided calories and hydration, and its production was a constant cycle in the household. Similarly, cider was made from apples where they were plentiful. Dairy products like cheese and butter were also crucial. Milking cattle or sheep daily was only the first step. The milk would be left to curdle, often with the addition of rennet from a calf's stomach, or acetic substance, to separate the curds from the whey. The curds would then be pressed, salted, and aged to produce cheese, a highly nutritious and storable food. Butter was made by churning cream, a laborious process that turned the fat globules into solid butter. Storage methods were as important as preservation techniques. Grains were stored in granaries, often raised on stilts to protect them from dampness and rodents. Meats were hung from rafters, stored in barrels, or kept in cool larders. Herbs were dried and hung in bunches. Every available space was utilized, every method employed, to ensure that the meager bounty of the harvest could sustain the family through the lean winter months and into the promise of the next spring. The knowledge of transforming raw ingredients into a year's worth of food was a testament to their deep connection to the earth and their remarkable resilience. Number 4. Building and repairing the home and tools. The medieval peasant's world was one of constant physical interaction with their environment. Unlike today, where specialized trades handle most construction and repairs, a peasant family was largely responsible for maintaining their own home and the tools they used daily. This demanded a comprehensive practical skill set in basic building, carpentry, and general repair, passed down through generations of necessity. Their homes, typically small, 1 or 2 room structures, were rarely made of stone. The vast majority were constructed from readily available local materials: wood, clay, straw, and wattle. Learning to build such a dwelling began with understanding the land itself, choosing a suitable, dry spot. The basic framework was timber, often rough-hewn posts, and beams from nearby woodlands, felled and shaped with simple axes and adzes. This was physically demanding work, requiring strength and a basic understanding of structural integrity. Peasant would learn how to notch and join timbers, how to create a stable roof frame. The walls were commonly made using the wattle and daub technique. Wattle involved weaving thin branches or saplings, the wattle, through upright wooden stakes, creating a flexible, sturdy lattice. Daub was then applied to both sides of this lattice, a thick mixture of clay, mud, straw, animal dung, and water. Learning the correct consistency for the daub was crucial. Too wet, and it would slough off. Too dry, and it would crack. Applying it evenly and smoothly, packing it firmly into the wattle, was a skill that developed with practice, often involving the entire family. Once dried, the daub created surprisingly robust and insulating walls. Roofing was another specialized skill. Thatch, typically made from bundles of reeds or straw, was the most common material. Laying thatch correctly was an art form. It had to be layered thickly and tightly from the eaves upwards, ensuring that water ran off efficiently and did not seep through. Peasants learned how to prepare the bundles of straw, how to secure them to the roof frame with twine or pegs, and how to create a waterproof ridge at the top. A poorly thatched roof meant a damp, cold, and uncomfortable home, prone to rot and collapse. This work required precision, patience, and a head for heights. Maintaining the home was a continuous task. Walls cracked, thatch deteriorated, and wooden beams eventually rotted. Peasants were their own repair crews. They knew how to mix a fresh batch of daub for patching cracks, how to replace a rotten section of wattle, and how to patch or re-thatch a leaky section of roof. These were not skills learned once and forgotten, but constantly refreshed through seasonal maintenance. They understood that neglect meant greater problems down the line, potentially rendering their dwelling uninhabitable. Beyond the home, peasants were responsible for most of their tools. While metal parts like plowshares, sickle blades, or axe heads might be purchased from a blacksmith, the wooden handles and shafts were almost universally crafted and maintained by the peasant themselves. This involved knowing how to select the right kind of wood for strength and flexibility, how to season it, dry it slowly to prevent warping and cracking, and how to shape it with an axe, knife, or chisel. Peasant could fashion a sturdy handle for a hoe, a rake, or a scythe, ensuring it fit comfortably and safely in their hands. They learned how to mend a broken cartwheel, repair a fence, or construct a simple gate. The ability to make and repair their own tools was not just about saving money. It was about immediate functionality. A broken tool in the middle of harvest could mean disaster, so the ability to fix it on the spot was invaluable. This skill set extended to simple woodworking. Peasant might build rough benches, a table, or storage chests for their home. They might construct simple animal pens or a frame for their loom. They understood the properties of different types of wood: oak for strength, willow for flexibility, hazel for wattle. They knew how to sharpen their own axes and knives, often using a grinding stone or a simple whetstone, maintaining the edge that made their work possible. This required a steady hand and an understanding of angles and friction. The self-sufficiency of medieval peasant life meant that building and repair were not separate trades, but integral parts of daily existence. It was a hands-on education in practical engineering, materials, science, and problem-solving, all without formal instruction. Their homes and tools were direct reflections of their labor, ingenuity, and profound connection to the materials of the earth around them. Number 3. Cranting clothes from raw materials. In the medieval world, clothing was not something readily bought in a shop. For peasants, every stitch of their garments was a testament to a complex, multi-stage process of transforming raw fibers into wearable fabric. This was a continuous year-round endeavor primarily undertaken by women, and it demanded an intricate set of practical skills learned through observation, repetition, and the guidance of elder family members. For most peasants, this was wool from their sheep or flax grown in their fields. If it was wool, the first step after shearing was cleaning the fleece, was often greasy and contained burrs and dirt. It needed to be washed vigorously, often in a river or large tub, and then picked clean by hand, removing impurities. This was a laborious and often cold task. Once cleaned, the wool needed to be prepared for spinning. This involved carding, a process where two flat paddle-like tools with wire teeth were used to brush the wool, disentangling the fibers and aligning them into a fluffy roll called a rollig. This step was crucial for creating an even thread. For flax, the process was even more intensive. After harvesting, the flax stalks were retted, a process of soaking them in water or leaving them in dew to rot away the outer stalk and expose the inner fibers. This was a smelly, time-consuming operation. Then the retted flax was scutched, beaten with a wooden blade to break away more woody parts, and finally heckled, drawn through a series of combs to separate the long, fine linen fibers from the shorter, coarser ones. Each stage required specific techniques and tools. Then came spinning, the heart of textile production. This was a constant activity, often performed while walking, tending animals, or during moments of rest. The most common tool was the drop spindle, a simple wooden stick with a weight, whirl, at one end. The spinner would draw out a few fibers from the prepared wool or flax, attach them to the spindle, and then twist the spindle, letting it drop and rotate. The rotation twisted the fibers together, forming a continuous thread. This required immense dexterity, a consistent touch, and a rhythmic motion to produce a thread of even thickness and strength. Later, the great wheel became more common, allowing for faster spinning but still demanding precise hand-eye coordination. Peasant women spent countless hours spinning. Accumulating enough thread for a single garment could take weeks or even months of steady work. The quality of the spun thread directly impacted the quality of the final fabric. Once enough thread was accumulated, it was time for weaving. This required a loom, often a simple warp-weighted loom or a horizontal frame loom, constructed by the peasant themselves. The warp threads were stretched lengthwise on the loom, while the weft thread was passed over and under the warp threads using a shuttle. Weaving was a rhythmic, repetitive motion, requiring patience and precision to create an even, consistent fabric. Different patterns could be created. though peasant fabrics were typically plain weaves or simple twills. The size of the loom limited the width of the fabric, meaning garments often had to be pieced together from narrower strips. The type of fiber dictated the fabric's properties: wool for warmth, linen for coolness and durability. Dyeing was another skill, adding color to the otherwise plain, natural-colored fabrics. Peasants utilized natural dyes found in their environment. Woad plants provided shades of blue, madder root yielded reds, and weld or broom provided yellows. Dyes were extracted by boiling the plant material, and then the yarn or woven fabric was steeped in the dye bath. This process required knowledge of mordants, substances like alum or iron salts, which helped the dye adhere permanently to the fibers. Without the correct mordant, the color would simply wash out. Peasant learned which plants yielded which colors, how to prepare the dye baths, and how long to leave the fabric to achieve the desired shade. Finally, the woven cloth was ready to be fashioned into garments. This involved cutting the fabric with simple shears or knives, and then sewing it together by hand with a bone or metal needle and spun thread. Peasant clothing was typically simple in design. Tunics, dresses, cloaks, and trousers, all made from rectangular or triangular pieces of fabric to minimize waste. Seams were functional, meant to hold the garment together for durability rather than for intricate tailoring. Mending was a constant activity. Patches were common, extending the life of a garment until it was threadbare. A garment might be patched and repaired countless times, passed down through family members until every fiber had served its purpose. Every stage of textile production, from the dirt on the sheep's fleece to the finished cloak, was a hands-on lesson in material science, patience, and unwavering diligence. It was a skill set that literally clothed the family, protecting them from the elements and allowing them to endure the harsh realities of medieval life. Number 2. Healing the body with Earth's bounty. Formal doctors were a rarity in the medieval period, largely confined to wealthy urban centers or monastic communities. For the vast majority of peasants, medical care was non-existent in the modern sense. When illness struck or injuries occurred, which they did frequently in a life of hard labor and rudimentary hygiene, the peasant relied on a blend of traditional knowledge, spiritual belief, and, crucially, the practical skills of herbal medicine and basic first aid. This knowledge was passed down through generations, often residing with the elder women of the village, known as wise women or cunning folk. The core of peasant healing revolved around herbalism. This was not a casual hobby, but a vital, empirical science developed over centuries of observation and trial and error. Peasants learned to identify a vast array of local plants, not just by sight, but by smell, texture, and the specific habitats where they grew. They knew which parts of the plant were useful: roots, leaves, flowers, bark, or berries. And they understood the specific seasons for harvesting each one to maximize its potency. For instance, common plantain, a ubiquitous weed, was known for its anti-inflammatory and wound-healing properties. Peasants would crush its leaves to make a poultice for cuts, insect bites, or blisters. Comfrey, nicknamed nipbone, was used externally for sprains, bruises, and even broken bones. Its leaves mashed into a paste and applied to the affected area, believed to aid healing. Chamomile flowers were brewed into a calming tea for sleeplessness, stomach upsets, or to soothe irritated skin. Yarrow was used to stop bleeding, either applied directly to wounds or brewed into a tea for internal bleeding. Elderflower and berries were used for colds, fevers, and coughs, often made into a syrup or infused tea. Mullein leaves were used for respiratory ailments, the smoke inhaled or the leaves brewed into a tea for coughs. The preparation of these herbal remedies was a skill in itself. It involved knowing whether to make an infusion, like a tea steeping plant material in hot water, a decoction, boiling harder plant parts like roots or bark for a longer time, a poultice, crushing fresh plant material and applying it directly, or an ointment, mixing crushed herbs with animal fat or beeswax. Correct dosage was also crucial. Too little might be ineffective. Too much could be harmful. This was learned through careful instruction and observation of outcomes. Beyond herbs, peasants practiced rudimentary first aid for injuries that were common in a life of manual labor. Cuts and scrapes were cleaned as best as possible, often with clean water or a diluted herbal infusion, and then covered with a poultice. Burns, a frequent hazard from open fires, might be soothed with aloe vera, if available, or other cooling plant compresses. For sprains and bruises, hot or cold, compresses were applied, and the affected limb might be rested or gently massaged. In cases of broken bones, the peasant would attempt to set the bone as straight as possible, often using splints made from straight pieces of wood and secured with strips of cloth. While their understanding of anatomy was basic, they knew that a straight limb had a better chance of healing properly. Fever and infection were constant threats. Peasants understood the importance of keeping a sick person warm and hydrated, offering nourishing broths. They would use diaphoretic herbs, those that induce sweating, to try and sweat out a fever. Basics hygiene, such as washing hands or cleaning wounds, was understood to some extent, though their knowledge of germ theory was, of course, non-existent. The understanding was more pragmatic. Clean wounds healed better. The healing skills also extended to managing pain, using herbs like willow bark, a natural source of salicylic acid similar to aspirin, for headaches or general aches. They understood that illness often followed periods of stress or poor nutrition, and that some illnesses were contagious. While superstition and folk beliefs were intertwined with their medical practices, there was a robust core of effective empirical knowledge about the healing properties of plants and basic care that allowed medieval peasants to survive and cope with illness and injury in an era without modern medicine. Their connection to the natural world was not just for food and shelter, but for the very preservation of their health. Number 1. Navigating the wilds and foraging for more. While much of a peasant's life was tethered to the village and fields, a significant portion of their survival skills involved an intimate knowledge of the wild spaces bordering their cultivated lands. Foraging, understanding the natural environment, and occasionally engaging in hunting or trapping, often illegally or under strict lordly control, were crucial for supplementing their meager diet and finding essential resources. This was an education in itself, learned by walking, observing, and memorizing the intricate patterns of the natural world. Knowing the local terrain was paramount. Peasant needed to be able to navigate the surrounding woods, hills, and rivers without getting lost, even in darkness or adverse weather. This meant recognizing landmarks, a specific cluster of trees, a distinctive rock formation, the bend of a river, the direction of prevailing winds, and the position of the sun and stars. Their mental map was detailed and precise, built from years of traversing the same paths, collecting firewood, tending animals, or walking to neighboring hamlets. They understood the local geography and how it influenced the flow of water, the density of forests, and the availability of resources. Foraging for wild food was a skill honed over generations, providing crucial supplements to their staple diet of grain and vegetables. This was especially vital during lean times or when the harvest was poor. Peasants learned to identify a vast array of edible wild plants. Berries, blackberries, raspberries, elderberries, wild strawberries, and blueberries, depending on region, were gathered in season, providing much-needed vitamins and a rare taste of sweetness. They knew which berries were safe to eat and which were poisonous. A distinction learned through careful teaching and observation. Nuts, hazelnuts, walnuts, and chestnuts were collected in autumn, offering valuable fat and protein. Peasant knew where the best nut trees grew and how to harvest them effectively before animals did. Wild greens, dandelions, nettles, sorrel, and wild garlic were gathered in spring, providing fresh greens that were often boiled or added to pottage. They understood which parts of the plant were edible and how to prepare them to remove bitterness or sting. Roots and tubers, various wild roots could be dug up, offering starches and nutrients, though these were often harder to identify and process mushrooms. This was a particularly perilous skill. Peasants had to know which mushrooms were edible and which were deadly, a knowledge passed down with extreme caution. The ability to distinguish between a delectable bolites and a fatal fly agaric was literal, life or death. Beyond food, foraging also extended to other vital resources. Firewood was constantly needed for cooking and heating, so peasants learned which types of wood burned best, which were easiest to split, and where to find fallen timber or collect deadwood without damaging growing trees. They knew how to identify suitable trees for building materials, for tool handles, or for crafting various wooden implements. They understood the properties of different types of clay for daub, or specific grasses and reeds for thatch, and where to find them. Understanding animal behavior was also part of this environmental literacy. While hunting was often restricted by forest laws imposed by the nobility, peasants might still engage in small-scale trapping or snaring for rabbits, hares, or birds to put a little meat on the table. This required knowing animal tracks, their preferred habitats, and how to set simple traps using natural materials. They also learned to read the signs of the forest for dangers, like the presence of wolves or wild boar. The peasants' education in the wilds extended to understanding weather patterns and the changing seasons. They could read the clouds, the wind direction, and the behavior of animals to predict coming rain or frost, which was crucial for timing agricultural tasks. They knew when the first spring shoots would appear, when the berries would ripen, and when the leaves would begin to turn, all vital markers for their foraging and farming activities. This deep experiential knowledge of their environment, accumulated over generations, allowed them to exploit every available resource, making the difference between survival and starvation. It was a subtle, complex, and vital skill set that connected them intimately to the rhythm and bounty of the natural world.